Good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to the Roses in the Ocean free professional development webinar, Working Together to Prevent Suicide. For those who don't know, my name is Lane Stretton. I'll be your host today, and with me will be Dr. Alex Haynes and Bruce Mcmillan, and we'll be talking about the relationship that exists between health professionals, organisations, and people with a lived experience of suicide, and exploring potential reasons why there might be a sense of reluctance to engage and what some of the great benefits are associated with engagement between lived experience people and industry bodies. We have a chat line and I'd encourage you to keep the questions coming through. We'll speak for about 45 minutes, and at the end of that 45-minute period, we will make sure there's time to answer as many of the questions that you have as we possibly can. So please make sure you keep those questions coming through, and I will monitor those and try and make sure that we get to them in due course. Firstly, let's introduce the people who'll be sharing the screen with me this afternoon. Firstly, Dr. Alex Haynes. Alex, welcome. Great to have you with us. Maybe we can start by asking you to tell us a little bit about yourself.
Yeah, sure. Thanks, Lane. Please don't feel like you have to refer to me as Dr. Alex Haynes for the whole webinar. It's really embarrassing, even just the once. Just Alex is fine. So for those who don't know me, my name is Alex. At the moment, I'm working as Director with the National Mental Health Commission. And when I'm working there, working on a few different things at the moment. So in particular, looking at a national children's mental health and wellbeing strategy, as well as developing a suicide and self-harm monitoring system for the country, and a number of other things as well. But before I was working with the National Mental Health Commission, I was working with the Illawarra Shoalhaven Suicide Prevention Collaborative, which is where I've had most of my involvement with Roses in the Ocean and where I met Bruce. So before that, my background is in psychology, working in various different contexts in mental health. So
Thanks,
yeah, nice to be here.
Yeah, terrific to have you with us today, mate. Bruce, introduce yourself, mate. It's terrific to have you with us today in this conversation.
Thanks, Lane. Thanks, Alex. Yep, my name's Bruce Mcmillan. I work as a mental health peer worker for an NGO in Wollongong. I previously worked briefly as a peer worker in the public sector in Sydney. I'm a lived experience member of the Suicide Prevention Collaborative, involved in a couple of the working groups in that organisation, and I'm a co-facilitator of a couple of support groups for people with varying types of emotional and psychological distress here in Wollongong.
Terrific. Thanks, Bruce. Can I say to both of you and to everybody who's been associated with the collaborative, what an amazing job you have done, and in some ways set a benchmark for many other groups that will be working in suicide prevention with lived experience right across the country. So I just want to say thank you for your work, but also understand that there's a lot of people behind the two of you who have also made amazing contributions to the work that you do. You've achieved incredible outcomes as a collaborative over the last 5 years. What has been the recipe for the achievement of these successful outcomes?
Well, like you said, there's a whole lot of people laying behind involved with this stuff. So, and I'm in fact no longer involved with the collaborative, but I have a feeling that it will always be one of the most proud moments in my whole career, because I do think, I agree, I think it has achieved quite a lot. Not so much, I mean, we could talk about sort of the concrete things you could point to, like rolling out programs in schools or media campaigns or, you know, various things like that you can kind of point to. But in a lot of ways, like some of the more important things that I think that we have gained from having the collaborative is it's just really embedded a collaborative way of working, so that now whenever opportunities come to the region, we're kind of already prepared and we all know each other. We've got good relationships. We already have a sense of what our communities are are needing and how they'd like it to play out. And it's happened the other way too. Bruce has been involved with this directly, as well as others, of course, but where it's actually been more from the community that we've identified what it is that we need, and we've been able to actually take that to the funders and say, look, this is what we really need and this is the shape it should take. Would you be interested in coming on board? So it's been fantastic in those ways. So I think it's more about the way that we've been working than sort of the things that I'd point to.
And Bruce, to you, behind all of the sort of functional activity that people get involved in are an amazing group of people. How have you managed to bring this group of really passionate people together and maintain the energy and the focus of the collaborative over the last 5 years?
Well, I hope I don't embarrass him too much by saying this, but in the specific case of the Illawarra Shoalhaven Suicide Prevention Collaborative, I think what has been essential in many ways is a person like Alex Haynes. I don't think it necessarily has to be Alex Haynes, but a person who is able to help that sort of disparate and at times divergent group of people come together for a shared aim and ambition and function effectively as a collaborative. I think that's probably an essential ingredient in the collaborative achieving anything at all, to be honest. So I think that's probably where we're looking to the future, is finding someone who can fill Alex's boots.
And Alex, from your perspective, and I know you're looking embarrassed there to be recognised so overtly, but it is such a critical part. You've got to have someone with the drive and determination to work through, many of the barriers associated with getting something like this together. If you were going to advise somebody who was willing to step into a role similar to the one that you've played in an environment outside of Illawarra Shoalhaven, what do they need? What are the essential elements of driving something like this to be successful?
Yeah, look, I should point out we didn't. This feels like we've inadvertently turned this into a recruitment ad because the job is actually being advertised at the moment. So I'm very hopeful that we get somebody really great in the role. I'm sure that we will.
I'm sure you will. Yeah.
It's a really fun position. But I think there's a whole lot of things you need. And one of those in particular in relation to being able to, genuinely collaborate with people with lived experience and involve them in the work, is I think you need a real commitment to the actual mission. I think that people can sort of smell if it's just about a job for you. And that's actually one of the things that made it incredibly difficult for me to leave the role. In fact, I was saying to Bruce last week, I really was not looking forward to telling the people with lived experience who were involved with the collaborative when I was leaving, because of the depth of commitment that we all have to the mission of reducing the number of deaths and attempts in our paddock, but also around the country. So I think you need that commitment to the actual mission first and foremost, and that is much more important than just having a job. I also think you need just a bit of humility. I mean, for me, I actually find working collaboratively and involving people with lived experience in particular, it's actually really, it takes the pressure off. It means that I don't have to have all the answers. So actually, I would much prefer the idea of working collaboratively. I have seen and I have experienced how the solutions that you come up with when you have lots of people's opinions in the mix, it actually generally works out much better than if you only had yourself. And I think there's a whole lot of stuff in terms of just our focus on the processes rather than necessarily the outcomes. We're just making sure that our processes are true to the idea of genuinely collaborating, genuinely involving people with lived experience, making sure that we're creating lots of opportunities for everybody, whether they're health professionals or people with lived experience, people who work in other sectors, making sure we're creating opportunities for them to actively contribute, both in meetings and outside of meetings, and being really flexible about the way that people might want to get involved. Not everybody's going to want to come along and sit in a meeting and speak up, but that doesn't mean that they can't contribute. And so there are lots of different ways that we created opportunities for people to, put their bid in, which has been really, that was really critical, I think.
And I think, essential to success is not only leadership, but also those who play a role in the implementation. Bruce, what do you look for in someone with a lived experience apart from the lived experience? What are you looking for in terms of those individuals that can support someone who might play Alex's role in, implementing all of the activities that go into being successful? Looks like we might have lost Bruce. Are you there, Bruce?
I am. Sorry, I just got a notice that my internet connection is unstable. So
okay.
I don't know exactly what that means.
It's
I missed the start of that question, Lane. Was that a question?
The question was really about saying, for every good leader, you need to have, a whole bunch of people that are prepared to step in and do a lot of the hard work that goes with making it successful. What do you look for in a lived experience person, apart from their lived experience, that is going to give you what you need?
Okay, so that's probably the $64,000 question. I guess a person with lived experience that wants to get involved in something like the Suicide Prevention Collaborative, and particularly involved in suicide prevention work just generally, needs to have a sufficient degree of recovery from whatever their particular lived experience happens to be able to contribute in an ongoing and sort of meaningful way without being overly distressed by the subject matter, because it's difficult work. It's difficult to work very often in the field of preventing people from taking their own life, and considering that people do come to the conclusion that their best option is to take their own life. So I guess someone who can sort of roll up their sleeves and do things, that's always helpful. But as Alex said earlier, not everyone can contribute in the same way, at the same pace, as consistently over prolonged periods of time. So I guess everyone has to be very aware that it is a collaborative effort, and that not everyone can contribute in the same way, at the same time, all of the time. So yeah, it's probably a long-winded way of not answering the question, but I think you might get the drift of what I'm saying.
I think it's a good way of answering the question, mate, because I do believe in the concept of self-care, and I do believe in that people need to, make sure that they're taking good care of themselves and physically, mentally, and emotionally to be involved in this work. Because as you said, it is, it's complex, it's emotional, and at times it's difficult, particularly around anniversary times and other really significant emotional moments during the course of a year. But how do you, how do you both help people take accountability for their own self-care, but also, Alex, for you, how do you set up a structure which actually incorporates self-care into it and ensures that the people that you bring in are well managed, are well catered for, are wrapped around with the right kinds of support?
Yeah, it's a really important question. I actually think that this is one of the things that is sometimes not done well, if I'm honest. And I think there's a real wave of momentum behind involving people with lived experience in suicide prevention and mental health work more generally over the last 5 years, and that continues to grow, which I think is a really positive thing. Of course I do, but I think there's a danger in some organisations not having a full appreciation for what that actually involves from the perspective of the people with lived experience. When you have a meeting, for example, and you have some people who are there representing organisations and some people who are there representing their lived experience, they're not there with the same kind of things at stake. It's a lot higher stakes for people with lived experience. So you might go to a meeting just as part of your job, and you put in your 2 cents as to how things should be playing out, and they reject your opinion and they choose to go a different way. Now, if that's just your job and you're just talking about something relatively arbitrary, it's, you can cope with that. But for some people who get involved from the perspective of lived experience in this kind of work, and then don't feel heard or don't feel respected or don't feel supported, you know, it can be really, really high stakes. And I think we need to be really mindful of that. And I'd like some organisations to be just a little more mindful of that. You can't just involve people with lived experience in a tokenistic way and think we've sort of ticked a box, but we'll still decide to do whatever we want. If you're going to involve people with lived experience, you need to genuinely commit to listening to what they tell you. You may not always do exactly what they want, but you need to respond in a really respectful, caring way so that everybody understands why what's happened has happened. And I'm not sure that that always is the case. I think that organisational responsibility is a really key part of people with lived experience being able to look after themselves through this kind of a process. But in the collaboratives context, I think we really we sort of cultivated an army of people with lived experience who just naturally kind of started to support each other quite a lot, in addition to whatever support we could provide them. So creating that space between meetings, you know, that can organically grow, of course, but creating that space and supporting that and encouraging that, I think that's a really important part of it as well.
Yeah, and Bruce, for you, I think Alex brings up a really interesting point, and there's some complexity in the relationship sometimes between, you know, lived experience people and non-lived experience people. To be on the other side of that fence, what does it feel like to, you know, to maybe feel like you're not being heard, or to feel like, you know, what it is that you're providing is not having the impact that you know, think it should, and that somehow, you know, lived experience is not being validated within the environment within which you're trying to work?
Well, I guess I have to be sort of a little delicate how I answer that question, because I haven't had that experience at all, I can say, in the collaborative. And having said that, I don't want to create the impression that I necessarily have had that experience in relation to my other work. But I'm probably a little bit uniquely placed in that I'm sort of a male of a particular age who hasn't really engaged with services all that much. But I don't want to speak on behalf of other people, but I know people have indicated to me that if you're a person with lived experience of suicidality, and say you've got a particular perspective on accessing the public health system and what that experience is like, if those experiences aren't validated, and if they're dismissed, and if they're not taken into account, and if they're not taken seriously, that can be significantly re-traumatizing to people. And I think a lot of people's experience of the public health system or the public mental health system is intrinsically sort of traumatizing anyway. So I think, as I say, speaking on behalf of other people, that's a real obvious problem with sort of people with lived experience not being validated, not being heard, and being dismissed and ignored. But as I said, I can't honestly say that I've had that experience either in my own workplace or in the Suicide Prevention Collaborative.
Thanks, Bruce. What other things might there be that might cause someone who has a lived experience to feel reluctant about getting involved in working with health professionals or organisations? Does anyone have any views on that, apart from, you know, not being acknowledged or not being validated, or, you know, the tokenistic element that can sometimes exist, or at least I've had people tell me can sometimes exist? What are some of the other barriers or complexities associated with working with health professionals and organisations?
Do you want to take that one, Alex?
Well, I was going to think it's a bit hard for me to say what it is that people with lived experience, why they might be reluctant to get involved. You're probably a better place to talk about that one. But I'll re-emphasise a point I made earlier, which is we found that by being flexible in the way that we enable people to get involved, that enabled a whole lot of people with lived experience to get involved who wouldn't have been able to otherwise. So not just a reluctance emotionally or otherwise, but logistically they could not have done it. So there are a number of people who I as part of my job, would go to cafes and have coffee with, or there was a couple of people who wanted to go to a bar, and who am I to be the judge on that? So I happily went along and met with them in a pub in order to get their input. I think being flexible is really important, including out of hours and on the phone any time of the day, sort of thing.
I think, is it also important that we understand that not every lived experience person suits every lived experience opportunity? And, to your point, Bruce, where you're talking about this idea that if I've had some degree of engagement with the system, then there's a validity to what it is that I bring. But if I haven't, then why am I involved in trying to have conversations around that kind of area? If I'm bereaved, as I am, maybe the place that I'm better using my lived experience is in, postvention or supporting people who might be bereaved by suicide. So is it about finding places where lived experience people fit naturally to use the stories and the skills and capabilities and knowledge that come with that to better work in that particular area?
Well, certainly, I believe so. Yeah, I think, as you say, not everyone is a good fit for everything, and like my particular, getting back to the first question you asked, and I hope I'm not just reiterating your responses to that. Some people have had very, very detrimental interactions with professionals in the health system and the mental health system. I don't count myself as one of those. I've had quite validating and very, very useful interactions over the course of my life with people in the private sector. Like I'd go and see private psychologists from time to time when I knew that things were sort of getting too much for me to cope with on my own. But yeah, I think that people need to be intuitive enough to know if what they're sort of considering getting involved with is actually a good fit for them, because I'm very, very well aware that I am representative of a relatively small part of the population, which is a relatively large part of the population that go on to take their own lives. But I haven't had the direct experience with professionals in the public health system to comment on that at any length. But I have engaged, as I said, quite helpfully and quite profitably with professionals in my own personal private life.
Lane, it's perhaps worth, just on a practical level, I can just speak to how we used to kind of orientate, for lack of a better word, people with lived experience. So initially we had one or two people that I just knew, so I called them and got them involved. And then it just kind of word of mouth that spread to the point where we ended up having people with lived experience that have come forward from the community and asked to be involved, which was just awesome. But the process of how we would respond to that is I'd have a bit of a chat with them over the phone, just to sort of suss out what it is they're after, what they're kind of looking for, because sometimes they just wanted to raise some money on their own with their own friends or something like that. But if they're keen, I'd then meet up with them. We would sit down and we sort of give them a bit of an overview of the collaborative and the various things that we're working on. We would talk about the different working groups we'd have or different meetings that we would have. And I'd literally just sort of lay it all out on the table and say, you take these resources home, but have a think about how you might want to get involved. And you could either come to a meeting or you could just read the minutes that we had on our website. So you could read them and not come to meetings. And you can email me input. You can give me a call and have input. We can catch up for coffee, you can have input, or you can come to the meetings and have input directly yourself. Or you can come to the meeting and just sit there quietly and just absorb the stuff. And then we talk about it afterwards. So there were lots of different ways that we sort of lay out on the table. And then it was for them to sort of have a think about which way suited them. But we'd also flag that it's totally okay and totally normal for people to get involved and then be various periods where they might be struggling a little bit and so need to pull back a bit. So we'd flag it up front that is a really normal part of people's experience, so that if they ever did feel like they were struggling and couldn't come to a meeting all of a sudden, they wouldn't start to feel like they're failing at that as well. And similarly, we'd say you can join this working group, but if you don't really feel like you fit there, then by all means, you can come and join this other working group. That's no problem. So we sort of flagged those kind of things to try and preempt some of the stuff that could happen for them, just as a way of normalising it and helping them find their feet as best we could.
But what you've described there is kind of an organic process in the beginning, but I'm certain as it grew and as more and more people got involved, and you ended up with enormous diversity in terms of people's backgrounds and histories and stories and traumas and personalities, etc. That we need to end up with a slightly more formal kind of way of working. Was there a process that you went through to say, okay, how do we set up a way that everybody understands how the collaborative works, so that we're all on the same page and we all understand not so much the ground rules, but just the fundamental principles of what it is that we're going to do together? Does that make sense?
Yeah, we did. So we had a statement of purpose in terms of reference for the collaborative, broadly speaking. That was for everybody. But just in the last 12, 18 months or so, I can't remember, Bruce, you might be able to tell me, but in the last year or so, the lived experience members of the collaborative themselves kind of said, I think that we need this kind of, can we call it like a welcome pack? That the lived experience members of the collaborative, they developed themselves as a way of kind of welcoming new lived experience members to the collaborative. And that included things like, one of the existing lived experience members touching base with the new lived experience member after meetings to check on how they're finding things, so to speak. So almost like a mentoring kind of informal, but a little bit formal.
And did that change things, Bruce? Was that a successful strategy just in terms of integration, but also setting some ground rules around, how we're going to behave and how we're going to work together, and what some of those really important interpersonal relationship kind of skills are going to be needed amongst the group?
I believe so. I don't know that I can necessarily comment on that directly, because I'm not apparently all that approachable a person. So I'm not the I'm not the mascot or the cheerleader or the sort of the welcoming party that often. But I think I don't sort of I don't in any way want to denigrate the collaborative, but the reality for a person like me, sort of a person without a university degree, for example, the reality is you go to a university campus and there's a lot of people there named doctor this and doctor that. There are a lot of academics there. So I guess a person like me could sort of feel somewhat intimidated by it all and somewhat out of place. So I think, and I've got anecdotal evidence to suggest that the welcome pack for lived experience people welcoming other lived experience people into the Suicide Prevention Collaborative has had the stated intention, it's fulfilled the stated intention of making people feel more immediately a part of something and supported in that, and like they're part of a group that's doing something positive to affect outcomes around suicide in our region.
So a slightly hypothetical question. There's an organisation somewhere across the country that is keen to bring lived experience people in to advise on what it is that they should do in their region. What are the first steps what's the advice that we offer to them on how to build their own collaborative, their own lived experience advisory group? What are the first steps that they need to take, the most important and critical steps?
Okay. I would suggest that a first step might be for them to sit back and honestly reflect on why they haven't already done that. If I'm honest, I think that if you do that really honestly, that might help you to identify some really practical barriers to involving people with lived experience, as well as potentially some underlying beliefs or values that need to be, I hate to use this word, but unpacked a little bit. They need to be understood a little bit.
What might some of those be, Alex? Let's just touch on what some of those beliefs or attitudes or biases maybe that are out there, and subconscious. Let's not, this is not always about people saying, well, I don't want lived experience people involved.
Yeah.
They haven't involved lived experience people in the past?
Yeah, I think, well, so I think it's both personal and organisational in my mind. So I think for some people have worked really, really hard for many, many years and spent an awful lot of money to earn their degrees. And so they've sort of made their way to the top of this kind of very hierarchical industry that we call health. And anybody who has power is usually reluctant to relinquish it. So I think on a personal level, there's some sort of reluctance to release some of that power, if I'm honest. And I think certainly, when you do your studies, you often get taught about the importance of the therapeutic relationship. And to be honest, when you see people who have got a shared lived experience, it just fast tracks that relationship and bond with people, and is so immediately helpful. There's perhaps an element of personal jealousy about just how potent that lived experience can be. But that's on a personal level. On an organisational level, oops, sorry, my Siri is just responding. On an organisational level, I think that there's like an unfamiliarity, or sometimes organisations are not used to having people with lived experience on this side of the counter, for lack of a better way of describing it. And I think that because that's unfamiliar, it can make organisations a little anxious. And when organisations get anxious, they get risk averse. So I think that can play into it. And I think some of the discriminatory beliefs could be things like, thinking that people with lived experience are maybe more unreliable than health professionals, that they maybe need extra support, or they're going to need more leave, or, they're not going to, they're going to have emotional issues that are going to mean they can't work. Now, in my experience, that is equally the case for health professionals. It's just that maybe health professionals are not permitted to, or have learnt the courage to say it out loud. But I think that's potentially some of it. And some of the practical barriers are that it's of involving people with lived experience is not always required in their funding, and they don't always have money to pay them for their participation. So that could be an organisation which is practical barriers. And, non-government organisations are usually pretty strapped for cash and time and so on. So unless it's required in their funding contract, they may choose not to do it. Or they may choose not to do it if they can't afford to pay for participation. And that might be a valued call. So I think there are a whole lot of things. But the first step for me would be for an organisation and for each person in it to honestly reflect on why they haven't involved people with lived experience to date.
And ideally what we do is quickly remove any of those attitudes or beliefs that, might have existed. And I think that's between both parties, because let's just, this is not just about lived experience people, attitudes and beliefs about lived experience people. It's about attitudes and beliefs that lived experience people may have about people that work within the system, or, the system as a whole. What do you think the necessary attitudes are that we bring to the table in those initial stages, both parties? Obviously this unconditional positive regard, part of that therapeutic process that you talked about before, Alex, is important. But what other attitudes are really fundamental to have at the beginning of this process that's going to set it up for success? Bruce, have you got any thoughts on that?
Are you talking, Lane, in relation to sort of setting up something like the collaborative?
Yeah, that's right, mate. Setting up a lived experience advisory group or a collaborative where, two groups of people who haven't traditionally worked together are now brought together and want to be successful. What are the attitudes that we need to be bringing to the table?
Well, exactly that positive regard, particularly, it needs to be mutual. Like, let's say, for example, there is a situation where there are lived experience people on one side and health professionals on the other. It's not necessarily automatically an us and them situation. It's not that one side is valid and the other side is invalid. One side has the answer and the other side doesn't. They're different perspectives and different types of knowledge, different types of experience, because the health professionals have their own lived experience of being health professionals in a system that can be traumatizing to them as well. So, yeah, I think just acknowledging that it's not necessarily a situation where the two groups are in competition with each other, but they can be very, very complementary to each other. Yeah, so I think before you even start to consider setting up something like that, there have to be enough people in the mix who are of that mindset to make it a viable proposition to begin with. I mean, if you've actually got two groups of people in opposition to each other, it's simply not going to work, is it?
Yeah, that's right. And Alex, wondering if you can comment on this. I mean, it's almost inevitable that there will be barriers that need to be overcome in that situation, despite our best endeavours to, to sit around the table and work collaboratively together. There are going to be barriers. What have been some of those barriers that you've noticed in the past, and how have you managed to work through those as a group?
Yeah, there definitely are barriers. I think that's, we talked really early on in the collaborative's life about how we're only going to make any ground if we are all committed to continuing to sit around the table even when we don't know what the answer is, or even when we don't know where to put our next foot. Because that's what's historically happened, and that's why change hasn't occurred the way that we would have liked, is that, you know, things get difficult, or there are some genuine or perceived reasons for why change is difficult or impossible. And so the conversation stops and we go back to doing whatever is, you know, easier. And I think that was a really key thing to embed within our culture early on, is just the commitment to keep sitting around the table until we knew what to do next, or we at least had some ideas, and then let's try that together and see if it works. That's played out on lots of different occasions, sometimes to the point where you can have a meeting and, 15 minutes into an hour-long scheduled meeting, you're not quite sure what to say next because we're not quite sure what to do next. But I think that requires just a comfort with being vulnerable amongst other people and just say, well, I don't know what to do now. What do you reckon? What could we do? Who could we find out from? So I think that's a really important one, just to overcoming those problems. But I mean, having a diverse range of voices it makes it rarer that you hit those brick walls, I find, because just with a number of different perspectives in the room, you generally come up with something you could do, or something that you think is a reasonable chance of working. So it might just be a case of, when you hit those walls, who else do we need to involve in this conversation to come up with some other ideas?
And Bruce, what about internally within the lived experience, group themselves, where people have divergent views about how things should be handled or what advice should be given? People are very passionate about their lived experiences, they should be, and people get very stuck in their lived experience, and the beliefs that come about as a result of their lived experience are held very close. How have you managed to, negotiate people through, complex conversations about what advice to provide to organisations?
I'll be really going out on a limb on that one, Lane. I don't really know that I've had all that much experience with a scenario like that. What about providing advice to organisations?
Yeah, Alex, any thoughts yourself, mate? Like, it's really about saying, I know I've been working with lived experience people now for quite a long time, and I know when I sit within a group that the divergence of opinion is huge. That some people feel that the answer to this problem is X, and other people feel that the answer to exactly the same problem is Y, and some people feel that the answer to the problem is Z, right? So we've got these lived experience perspectives that are different about how to deal with one issue that lived experience needs to inform. And I just wonder how you've dealt with some of the, the complexities of working with such divergent views.
Well, when people are speaking about their own experience, then they're right. So if one person is speaking from their own experience and they say the wall should be black, and another person speaking from their own experience say the wall should be white, then what you shouldn't do is paint it grey, because then nobody's happy. It might just be about trying to think through how do we make sure that those who want a black wall get a black wall, and how do we make sure those who want a white wall get a white wall? So there might be different approaches required. They might need completely different mechanisms to sort of get to the people who need them. It's playing it out and then coming up with a way, okay, so if we're going to try a black and we're going to try a white, how are we in a month's time or however long going to be able to sit back here together and actually unpack whether black worked for those who want black and white worked for those who want white? So then it's about building in some evaluation kind of feedback loops, so that together you're kind of constantly learning about what works and what doesn't. That's how I would approach it.
And have there been any surprising outcomes? You know, when you've put together this collaborative, and you know, you talked before about, you know, sort of making it up on the way. You know, almost creating the path that you were walking, because there hadn't been anything like this before. And so in some of those meetings where you sat there and said, well, we actually don't quite know what to do next. Anyone got any ideas? That's kind of creating the path. What have been some of the surprises that have come about as a result of this kind of organic process? I think from both perspectives. Alex, maybe from your perspective, leading this, and then Bruce, maybe from your perspective, engaging in the actual collaborative itself.
Yeah, look, one of my greatest surprises is that that it's still going. I think that's really good. I couldn't have dreamed for it to be as significant as it's been, which is really, really pleasing, and credit to everybody involved. Look, I just think everything is better when you create a space where people can be their complete selves, and they can bring their complete selves to the room. I mean, that's just my experience of it personally, and also just witnessing other people. And people with lived experience, just, they do that. People with lived experience, I mean, that's because they're bringing their own personal experience, and it's such an intimate personal experience that they're generously sharing. So what I've seen is them actually kind of teach other people in the room to bring their complete selves to the table as well. And that's been remarkably beneficial. So that means that people with lived experience, and not just bring their lived experience, but all their other skill sets, all their other experiences that they've had in life. And then you have people who are health professionals or organisational reps who also happen to be a musician, and so are now in a meeting about suicide prevention, able to talk about what they could contribute as a musician. I just find the relationships that come out of that so much more deep and meaningful. And so the work is not just more rewarding, but I think more effective. Yeah, I mean, I didn't expect it to be, I thought that having people with lived experience involved with the work would benefit the work. But I didn't expect having people with lived experience involved to be so helpful as it has been for people with lived experience. I think a lot of people who have been involved with the collaborative have actually talked about finding it like a really important component of their recovery. And I think like that's incredibly moving for us.
Bruce, what's been surprising for you?
Well, all of it really. The fact that, as Alex said, not only the fact that it's still going, but the fact that I'm still involved. I'm not naturally a joiner. I got involved initially because my partner suggested it would be a good idea, and a few years later, I'm still involved and very actively involved. But I guess sort of from a sort of organisational or procedural perspective, just the fact that so many organisations can come together to work on a problem that essentially everyone has agreed we don't have very many of the answers to now, and what we've been doing up to this point hasn't really been working all that well. Just the humility, the organisational humility of all of these NGOs and local councils and the local health district, et cetera, the list just goes on, who are able to say, okay, what we're doing isn't working all that well, and we need to improve what we're doing. We need to find collective ways that we can do this. And in a late capitalist neoliberal economy, for this to be happening at all, for these organisations to be sort of willingly sharing information and willingly sharing workloads and willingly sharing, this type of very important activity with each other is absolutely astounding to me. Like the cynical side of my nature is always amazed by it.
Fantastic. Thanks, Bruce. So guys, a couple of questions as we now start to close out. We've got one from Leah Harvey. Hi, Leah. Nice to have a question from you. Alex, do you feel that the self-care of lived experience people should be a priority in debriefing, supervision and ongoing professional development education, as this could help with the confidence and safety of lived experience persons?
Well, yeah, the short answer is yes. Because if you're not looking after yourself, you can't really contribute. And I do think it's, like I said before, I think some of that responsibility needs to be put on the organisations that are inviting people with lived experience to get involved. And I think that some do that, some do that really, really well. And some could reflect on how they could do it better. But I think that the way that you debrief or do professional development, and some of that has been a little more formal. Like we've actually, as Lane, you've been involved, we've had a number of people, lived experience members of the collaborative, go through Roses in the Ocean training. We've had a number of people where we've sort of supported them to go to conferences or other professional development to try to, keep growing and keep learning skills, and sort of, like I talked before, about building this army of people who are equipped and ready to contribute. I think that's sort of the formal side of it. The informal side of it is more the relational stuff, the being available after meetings, to have a bit of a debrief, have a bit of a chat, calling people between meetings or just catching up if you haven't heard from them for a little while, being available when they want to call you, even if you're busy and in a meeting. That's, I think, part of the gig. If you're going to involve people with lived experience, that's how you need to do it.
Yeah, I think there's some amazing advice in there, Alex. Thank you. I think it's really important that we understand that lived experience people are not just simply inputting in a meeting by meeting basis, but they're fully involved and fully invested in the entirety of what it is that's being done, and therefore active engagement with them in and outside of meeting environments is actually really important. Bruce, have you got anything to add to that?
I'll just reiterate what Alex said. Basically, lived experience involvement in the Illawarra Shoalhaven Suicide Prevention Collaborative is professional development. It's been one of the most important single activities of my life, actually, being involved in this thing down here. And it's, I've said it before in other contexts, it's sort of one of the things that have really contributed to what has been quite an unfortunate life for me, having meaning and purpose that it wouldn't otherwise have had.
Yeah, thanks, mate. A couple of other questions. This one came from someone who's anonymous, but they've said, would you have any strategies on how to appeal to someone's empathy for system change when they're constricted by the system itself? And I assume that they're talking about someone that works within the system, who has empathy for adjustments and changes, but can't find a way of being able to do that. What advice could we give them on strategies to work within the system?
I just firstly have empathy for them. I think working in a system that breeds helplessness and hopelessness is really traumatic. And I think each person has to make a call for themselves as to how long they're willing to stay in that kind of a environment. I know myself, I worked in community mental health in various settings for many years and tried to get a number of things started up and kept getting knocked on the head. I once had a professional, like a performance review kind of meeting with my manager, the 12-month kind of performance review. And they said, basically, Alex, just get out of here. You know, it's awful. Get out of here while you've still got some energy. So I think I just really empathise with people who are feeling that way about the work that they're doing, because that's really bloody awful. So I think that'd be my first port of call, and then just to see if there's anything we can help them to do from inside or out of the system. I think that there's always... So I've never found in any of our conversations with, you know, big organisations or little organisations or community members, I've never found anybody in the context of suicide prevention that is happy with the status quo. So nobody has ever at any point argued to keep things exactly as they are. So if the organisation or the system isn't changing, it's not because people don't want to. So I would encourage them not to personalise that. People are not meaning to roadblock this change, but it's worth trying to unpack exactly why it's not moving and target those reasons. But I'd empathise.
I think it's also, yeah, you know, for me, I think it's critical that they don't give up, Alex, as well. You know, I think there's a lot of amazing, passionate, invested people that work within our mental health system who are frustrated by what it is that's happening. But change is coming. It feels to me like there is a groundswell of movement which is happening within suicide prevention. Let's separate it out from mental health, but certainly within suicide prevention, and lived experience is at the heart of that. And I would say to people who are frustrated but have deep empathy for change, do what you can within your circle of influence. Bring, you know, your energy and your heart and your passion and your compassion and empathy to everything that you do, and work within the system to bring about change in the same way that people outside of the system are working to change the system as well.
I would agree that there's never been a better time than now. We've got more momentum than we've ever had for change. So I think that there's a lot of big pieces of the puzzle are aligned at the moment. So if they've got any energy left, then now's a good time to push.
Gents, it's been a great opportunity to have a conversation, and you know, we've received some feedback online to say you know, people have really enjoyed hearing from both of you. So thank you so much for being a part of our webinar today. And can I also say thank you on behalf of all the people that are impacted by the amazing work that you do and continue to do both in your region and within the mental health system. Thank you. And it's a pleasure to hear about what it is that you're doing, and to see the energy and commitment that you bring to your work. And we really appreciate it. And I really appreciate having you on today.
No worries. Been a pleasure.
Thank you very much.
All right. We'll catch up again soon. Bye-bye.
All right.
Bye.
Bye.